Hello, everybody. My name's Milan Starcic. Welcome to Freedom Rising, a podcast dedicated to empowering individuals on the journey to personal growth, lasting serenity, and freedom from addiction. Tune in and join the movement. Your journey to freedom starts here. You know you are welcome anytime. Hi, everybody.
Hi, everyone.
Anytime. Welcome to the 20th Recovery Freedom Rising podcast. We're here to grow in our journey together. I'm Milan Starcic with my co-host, Tessa. We neither represent, promote, or demote any 12-step program or organization. We're two souls on the path of recovery with the desire to expand our lives and experiences and share them with you. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself, Tessa?
Yes. So, I am 1 year clean today, and actually, at this time last year, I was actually getting arrested and looking in the states. We call them felony charges. I was looking at some felony charges and a decade or more of jail time, and I spent the whole week of Christmas in jail. I missed my kiddos' Christmas and everything. Um, and I came out to a home without electricity or running water, and it was a hot mess, right? And I remember in that moment, right? Like the first thing I felt was a lot of relief, right? A lot of because for the first time in 25 years using, right, I didn't have to lie anymore. And then I felt gratitude, and I knew I wanted to live a different way. So I remember all I really had was a phone, right? So I started looking online, and I found a program that has helped me come to this 1 year mark clean, right? And ever since that point, things have, it's been very difficult, right? But everything's been going well, and here I am celebrating with you,
And
Milan.
I'm so happy to celebrate with you. Happy birthday, Tessa.
Thank you.
For anybody out there, um, I do sort of an in-person meeting once a week, but I do an online meeting every day. And Tessa literally came on that meeting in the hot mess state she was talking about, and I've watched her gain some serenity, gain some color
Absolutely.
back in her skin, and actually, actively involving herself in a recovery community, not just in my group, but in a lot of other groups, and as well, in a lot of ways, being a leader at reaching out to other ladies who are in need of help. I'm
Absolutely.
really so proud of you, Tess. And,
Thank you.
man, I watch so many people all the time relapsing and not making it. Like when Kyle said to you today on the meeting today that a lot of people don't make it. Tess, he was right, and it really
Yeah.
is such an amazing milestone. It's not the distance, it's the fact you're still here. Like
Right.
that's I just see it all the time. So
It's not
I have a
easy.
I have a question that I ask everybody to
Yeah.
start out with. What was the pivotal moment when the program sparked a recovery fire in your heart? Now, I just want to explain this in the sense of like maybe you were coming to meetings to not go to jail for a long time. Like a lot of people come in and they want verification to begin with, right? But I'm talking the moment where something changed and you were like, this could work for me too, or this is like, I'm so excited this is working. Just, that moment that fire sparked in you.
Right, right. Well, it's interesting you say that, right? Because that wasn't one of the conditions. Like I actually I found what I did, right? Because I just knew I was sick and tired of being sick and tired. But once I found the program, right, that I'm in, it was probably I want to say between like the 30 and 90-day mark, right? Because the 30-day mark is where I kind of found my idea of a higher power. Um, and I was like, okay, I can do a little more than meetings, right? Like I'm open. Like I realized at that point, like I'm open to, fully working a program. And then honestly, it was service that I knew. Like, I think I started because I didn't meet the requirement, so I had to do a little bit of a different process to do service. And I think that was around the 60 to 90-day mark. Once I started doing service, I knew like I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna do it as hard and as efficiently and as full out as I possibly can.
And when you say you were starting service, can you explain for somebody who's new out there
Sure.
what that service was? Just so that because they're going to be curious, like
Yeah,
service, what's
absolutely.
that, and how can I be part of that, right?
Right, right. So in the program I'm in, there's different things called service positions. So in the meeting, there's people that have to lead the meeting. There's people that do different things like timing people, the amount of time people talk. There's there's people behind the scenes of the meetings that we do that take care of the financial stuff, like the treasurer, the people that send out literature, which is all the different books and literature that this program has, right? There's people that deal specifically with that, making sure first timers and newcomers get the opportunity to have that literature if they want it. There's so many different aspects to it because it's a world international program, right? It can go all the way up from just a specific meeting level service to doing service for your region or your area or your country, or even up to the international level. It's you can go as far as you want to go with it. I'm pretty happy keeping it with my meeting right now. Maybe one day we'll get up there.
For anyone who's never met Tessa before, she's literally known as Super Time Tess. She is the best
Yeah.
timer out there. No holds barred. Okay, so
Yeah.
now one last question before we get into our topic. Would
Yeah.
you be willing to share the three things that have changed the most in your life from being in the program and from working the steps?
Okay, so the first thing would be my sense of self, right? I went from absolutely hating myself, not wanting to live, like there was no hope in life, and I was basically just living so other people wouldn't be sad, right? That's changed immensely to now I want to live like I didn't even know what happiness was before active addiction, right? Before I got into it. So I'm at a point now where I'm going to be 40 next year and I can say I'm happy and like I'm excited to live life for me and for those people I love, right? The next thing that has changed is my house, right? I believe my house is a reflection of how I feel about myself, right? And at this time last year, when I went to jail, my house had no electricity, no running water. It was like it looked like a hoarder's house. It was absolutely terrible, and it by no means perfect now by any means, but it's clean, right? And if I can't clean it myself, I ask for help now, right? That's something I didn't do. I didn't ask for help, right? I was too busy chasing other things. Um, and the third thing that's changed are the is the isolation. Um, before like at this time last year, all I really cared about was my kid and my my drugs of choice. I lost everyone in my family in 2018, and I because I lost the people that loved me most in my life, I believe that there was no hope of that in life, like no, not even my child, right, could love me the way those people I lost did, like they knew me from a baby. um and now I have a whole lot, like not hundreds, but I have dozens of people that I call family that I can click on and I can go see, every day, and a lot of them at any time, right? Because I know people in different time zones. So whenever I need to talk, and that's I guess part of that, right? That isolation and not talking to anyone, to now I reach out to people to talk. And so that I'd say those are the three biggest things that have changed from working the steps.
That's awesome. That's a great message of some hope for people. Some people say that their home is a reflection of their home inside. Like
Yes,
you were saying.
absolutely. I believe that.
And for myself, I feel that my community inside recovery has replaced so many decades of loneliness and false community. Like I
Absolutely.
really feel, like we've never met, and you're a sister to me, Tess. And, and I was really proud that you were willing to share some of your time today on this day
Of
of yours,
course.
because I feel that one of the things, like with the way that we do it with birthdays and key tags in the program. So anybody who's new out there, if somebody's celebrating a year or multiple years, they have a birthday cake, a celebration at a meeting. And so today, this morning, just before we started this, Tessa has celebrated this on ours. But, for somebody who's just maybe checking out these and hasn't done a bunch of meetings yet, this is a great way to see the program in action and to see look at Tessa and I smiling and laughing, and we don't need anything external to life to bring us to this
Right.
joy right now.
And
So,
did you and I found it really uncomfortable at first, to accept that, right? Like to accept that love, right? I got so used to that isolation that it was really uncomfortable at first. And then like you said, here we are, right?
well, and it's almost for myself, I felt like, are they just full of shit?
Yeah,
You know,
absolutely.
like
Like they're all fake.
what, well, because, like I really had some experiences where I felt like people that I was really trusting or thought that loved me did things that weren't examples of love. And so,
Right.
like
Yeah.
my heart had been broken from being betrayed, you know, more than
Mm-hmm.
once in my life. And so, what was I going to think when I'm sitting in a room full of addicts? That they're more honest? But
Right.
oddly enough, after a bit of working the program, I think that they are.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So the topic you chose for today was trauma and grief in early recovery. Could you explain what these two mean to you, maybe one at a time, and then why you chose this for today?
Right. Well, we've kind of been given little hints on that, haven't we? So trauma to me are tragedies or losses or changes in life that detrimentally or negatively affect me, right? um Grief, it goes along with it to me, for me, because grief is a result of those traumas, so it's kind of like my reaction to those different changes or losses. um B but for me, grieving or grief has like a two-part process, right? It's a mental and a physical thing, and, I find it a lot of time uncontrollable, so it's more than an emotion, right? It's grief is a kind of an all-encompassing, state of being. As far
Okay.
What about you? Do you agree?
Well, so I wanted to make sure I knew the difference between the two. So I looked it up, and it says trauma is a term used to describe the challenging emotional consequences that living through a distressing event can have for an individual. Traumatic events can be difficult to define because the same event can be more traumatic for some people than for
Yes.
others. And then it broke down trauma into three things: acute, chronic, or complex. An acute
Yes.
trauma results from a single incident. Chronic
Mhm.
trauma is repeated and prolonged, such as domestic violence or abuse.
Mhm.
And complex trauma is exposure to varied and multiple traumatic events, often an invasive and interpersonal nature. So,
Yes.
for trauma, when I think of trauma, I think of a few things. Like my father was paralyzed when I was conceived and died when I was 4. I was raised without a dad. And I look back to moments where, you know, um, I would almost, try to like latch on to an uncle or my grandfather or a neighbor's dad or something like that. There's just so many points where when somebody has a dad, if you don't have a dad, guess what? Life's different, like,
Mhm.
uh, and,
Absolutely.
and some of that, inevitably would have caused some trauma, so. I'm not sure that his actual death was trauma to me, maybe to my mom, but I was four.
Right.
Like, you know, my like uh, I mean, I ran up and jumped in the coffin with him at the funeral when I was four because
Yeah.
I had only seen him lying in a hospital bed. So I used to
Right.
I guess I climbed up on dad. So I like jumped in and you want to talk about a traumatic event. You should have seen my aunts and uncles flipping out when I'm in the coffin.
Right.
That was the first moment in my life where I learned about the smell of formaldehyde. I
Absolutely.
was like,
So that could
whoa.
have a traumatic
I'm like,
effect on
Dad,
you from here
stinky.
out.
Like,
Yeah.
um, and then, you know, like trauma for me was, you know, being raised in a really rough city. From the time I was 3 years old to grade 10, I had to fight at least once a week in my life. Sometimes to go 2 blocks in my neighborhood unattended with
Mhm.
another friend, I had to fight my way through someone else's
Absolutely.
blocks. And I feel like that has had a really traumatic effect on me. And then, you know, some of the points in my addiction, for sure, you know,
Mhm.
and a really abusive relationship I had with somebody in my 20s. I would say, you know, and then grief. So grief, I looked it up too. I'm going to say them both because I might as well for
Yeah, of
anybody's listening.
course. Yeah.
Grief is the anguished experience after significant loss, usually the death of a loved person. Grief often includes physiological distress, separation anxiety, confusion, yearning, obsessive dwelling on the past, apprehension about the future. And examples of taking care of yourself while grieving. And I just wanted to read these because I feel that a lot of them kind of relate to our program. Is number
Right.
one, take care of yourself. Grief can be hard on your health. Number
Mhm.
two, make mealtime plans. Number three, talk with caring friends. Sounds like a meeting. Number four, participate in your favorite actions. Can also be a meeting if you like them. Number five, reach out to your faith community. Well, recoveries kind of have faith community in some ways. Number six, see your doctor. Probably not likely for me. And number seven, morning takes time. And so, you know, I feel that I lost a friend on January 1st, actually, to an overdose of like 2020. And I really went into a bad bout of grief after that. And I feel that actually it was something that I've processed inside recovery. But maybe we'll get back to that later on. So for me, when you were talking
Absolutely.
about these two things, I was like, I'm good to go on some talking about this today because
Right.
my life
Absolutely.
has had it. And I know for you, inside your story, maybe you'll get into that, has been some loss of family members that, you know, like I feel like for myself, I had some grief I couldn't process until I was straight. You know,
Mhm.
like I call it like the
Absolutely.
hanger honor grief. Like,
Mhm.
because you know, they say that you start to feel your emotions in sobriety, but the thing is that it's not even just feeling them, it's like processing them. Like I was sad enough when I was high, but
Right.
I never had a way to understand how I should package that, you know,
Right.
and
Absolutely.
in the steps. So can you explain, okay, can you actually, no, it's your turn to ask a question.
Well, you answered the first one. Have you experienced any processing of any trauma or grief in recovery, or what were some of the traumatic things or the things that, situations that may have caused you grief went through?
So
Um,
I would like to answer to just finish answering that because I
yeah,
feel that I mentioned the trauma, but I also believe that a point of, you know, kind of conversations like this is to share a message and not just the mess.
right,
And
absolutely.
so first thing is like, you know, doing the steps, right? Having that surrender and, you know, that surrender that is involved in the first three steps of any 12-step program is getting out of that selfish thought that we control everything. And so a lot of my distress about my trauma and my grief was from selfish controlling thoughts. And the, kind of the opposite of control is acceptance. And it's really now my official life's purpose is to learn acceptance in my life. So there was a lot of things that I had resentments for. Um, when I did my step 4, which is to do the fearless moral inventory, or the moral inventory that makes me fear less, and and for me, doing that really helped me to stop living in the past and pulled me more into the present moment, and you know um pushed me towards acceptance. I'd like to say yes, I gained acceptance, but I
Hmm.
didn't. But I at least was shown the direction I need to go. I was on this meeting a couple weeks ago. I left our meeting early. I finished recording a song, and I ended up on this meeting, and this lady was giving a talk who had like 37 years experience, and this other lady came on who had just under a couple decades, and she said, I use my emotions now as direction for what direction my recovery needs to go. Like signposts, like almost like the speed limit on the highway, or the sign like turn left for Albuquerque if you're going to go see Coulter. But like, you know, and so I really like that concept now, is that what emotion am I struggling with? Well, then that's the direction I need to go, almost, in the opposite. So I'm trying to push towards acceptance, and
Hmm.
losing a lot of shame and guilt and anger about past traumatic events. What about
Right.
you for that same question, Tess?
Well, so just to kind of and backtrack just a little bit, right?
Yeah.
So what all of that process you were just talking about is why I thought it was kind of important to talk about this. For me, I don't, you could say I experienced all three, but now in general, I would say I went through kind of the complex trauma, right? And because of all that complex trauma, right, I deal with a lot of grief, right, as a result too.
Do you want
There's
to
some other
explain
things.
any of your
Yeah,
traumatic events just so somebody out there
absolutely.
could relate to it?
I was
Okay.
getting ready to go into that. Yes, sir. So for me, so what I would call my traumatic events, mine started from my first memory. Some of my first memories are about sexual abuse that happened to me under the hands of a babysitter and their children. From there, my next memory is of my the domestic abuse from my father and my mother, right? And then they went through a divorce when I was young. And I remember actually having kind of an opposite reaction to that. I know a lot of people have talked about, well, children are just absolutely like traumatized by their parents' divorce, but I was happy because I knew that my parents weren't going to be fighting anymore. And that was at like 5 years old, right? I also come from a family of addicts, right? So I've witnessed drug use, domestic violence, like all jail, like all these different things and personality changes. I grew up basically trying to survive that. Like, so that's where we get into when as I got older, right? I was not taught any coping mechanism. All I saw was, okay, to cope with these things, we drink or we use drugs. And that makes it all go away. But and then also alongside that, I was taught as long as I'm working and I can pay for whatever I do and use, and then the consequences of those actions, I could do whatever I wanted. And I took that wholeheartedly, and then so that pattern of witnessing or being a victim of domestic violence, as well as that the being a victim of sexual abuse, definitely played a pattern throughout my whole life. um then by 2018, I had already lost my mother and grandma. I lost them in the same year when I was 23, and then in 2018, I lost the whole rest of my immediate family. Like the people I was closest to growing up, I lost them like within a matter of like a couple of months of each other. And it was
Were you
they were all
using at that point?
unexpected. Yes,
Okay.
absolutely.
Just for
Yeah.
clarity. So,
But this took in that I'm glad you asked that because before that, I was using. However, there was a huge, huge change in both the frequency, the level, and the pattern of which I used. I went from um using every day, and it's like there's no such thing as a functional addict, right? But functioning, right? Like I was still working, I was keeping my house clean and taking care of my child, right? But once I went through those losses, I felt that physiological change they mentioned that can happen. Really, I could feel it. And it was at that point I could feel I was going down. And as much as I didn't want to leave my child or anything, I also, the pain was so unbearable that being alive and around my child, I wasn't of any use. So my that's where my addiction kind of took off, so to speak, to the much deadlier and much more harmful aspects that within a matter of 3 to 4 years, I was like 88 pounds when I went to jail. I had actually just gotten out of the hospital like the year before. I'd been laying on my front porch for 2 days, and one of my neighbors had called. Um, my heart rate was starting to change. Like if those cops hadn't put me in an ambulance that year before, I wouldn't have been alive to even go to jail. Right. And that's what ended up saving my life. Right. But throughout all this, I thought I was processing, right? At one point I even tried to get clean on my own for about a year. And I went and I did the grief support and things like, some things like that, which helped. And I use some of those tactics now as well, but um it just wasn't enough, right? Because I still didn't have those regular coping mechanisms that a lot of people learn in life. And I would always go back to using. And then it wasn't until I went to jail, right? And there's a lot of trauma and grief that come from going to jail, as for me, especially going over Christmas. And as a result of that, like what I needed was that ego break, right? Because like I said, I was taught to, I can use and do whatever as long as I could pay for it. So that was kind of my big thing. Like, okay, you all might know I'm doing drugs, or you all might know I'm doing these things I shouldn't be doing, but you can't prove it. Well, a couple felony charges, it's out there for the world to see, right? Like there's now a picture out there of me, right? That forever will be there because of the choices I made. However, if that had not have happened, if I had not had that ego break and had that lowest, for what I would say is my rock bottom, right? I would have never, my ego would not have allowed me to be open-minded or willing or even give me that platform, because I had been lying for at least 25 years. A, it was a survival tactic, right? So it was all I knew. And B, it was part of my addiction, right? So if I had not been given that opportunity basically to start at the bottom, right? I would have had to felt the need to keep lying, right? But going to jail and really being humbled, it was an opportunity, right? If I had only been in there a couple hours, which me and this wonderful lady, I consider a mom now, she ended up getting me out of jail about a week after, right? And we were talking about this not too long ago. She's like, I knew if I only left you in there for a day or a couple hours, you weren't gonna get it. She's like, that's why I waited a week. She's like, it wasn't that I didn't love you. She's like, I wanted to help you. And she was so right. She was so
She
right. If
could
I
have
had,
bailed you out
yeah,
earlier.
earlier, I had a
Oh,
very high
smart
bail.
lady.
But she was like, this is your, she goes, I give everybody I love one chance, right? Like, and she was actually there for my dad, and she really tried to help my dad. But he was also like, just to kind of give you the extent of him, how what I was taught, he was serious when he said rehab is for quitters. Like he was like, and one of the things he actually held against me to his death, till his death, which what his he passed away about a year before I went to jail, I believe, if I remember correctly. 2 years before I went to jail. um but he held against me the fact that he had tried to kill me in 2018, right before the others and then him passed away. But as
He
a
tried to
result of
kill
that,
you?
Yes, he was, basically he was really bad off, certain alcohol and certain specific drugs, right? And he was, because he had drank all his life, right? He was also going through some alcohol, some long-term chronic alcoholism effects, right? Some the Wernicke's, some stuff like that. And he had a choice, because I finally, for the first time in my life, I pressed charges on him, right? I two assault charges within 2 weeks, right? And the cops were like, look, we're following you. You have to go press this EPO, because otherwise us keep coming out here to deal with this it doesn't matter. We can't take him to jail. Like, there's nothing we can do here. And I knew how he felt. Like, that was the ultimate betrayal in my family. Like, I've had family members have hurt each other, right? And they wouldn't even press charges on each other. And I mean, very bad kind of things, right? Almost killed them kind of things. So that was very ingrained in me. And so when I went to do this, press these charges, I knew it was going to change things, but I did not know the extent. But anyway, so it ended up, instead of, he had a choice of taking an EPO or going to rehab for 28 days. He ended up begrudgingly being forced, or choosing, which he had to choose. The judge gave him the choice. He chose the rehab, but I tell you what, he held that against me till his death. He he was so mad at me. He was so angry. He changed the will. He did all these things because I did that, because I did the right thing for me and my child, right? Because we couldn't be around that. We couldn't deal with that, right? Um and so he held that against me. So when I say, he said rehab is for quitters, he was adamant, and it was more than a joke to him. Like, he was really against it. He didn't want help. He didn't think he needed help. He felt like if he worked hard, he could play hard, right? And everybody should just deal with him. The problem was, most of the time he doesn't remember some of the most traumatic things he inflicted on people, right? And that's kind of, I was also blind to that, right? And I was very blind to any trauma or pain I inflicted on people. Um, so if I'm blind to that much, right, I'm blind to kind of processing that. Sure, I thought about it, but most of the time when I thought about that pain and that grief and that trauma, right, I needed to use, because it hurt, right? Like, I didn't want to feel that, right? And the only way I knew to make it go away or stop it, right, was to use, right? So by going to jail, getting that ego break, that allowed me to be open-minded to something else, right? To the possibility that I could live a different way, right? Or try to live a different way. Anyways, and that's when I found, the program of recovery. And in that, I think a lot of people, right, for the first time, are processing all these things that they went through, that they may have used their addiction to hide from, or to not deal with, or because it hurts so much, right? um that's kind of the root of why they used, right? Or at least it is for me, right? I can tell you that is all the root of why I used, because I didn't know any other way to deal with it, right? I didn't know how normal people, right, lived, or how they dealt with people dying or people hurting them, right? I had no idea. And what I did know, right, was the total opposite of the right thing to do. So as I came into recovery, a lot of these things came front and center. That's why I was talking about some of that isolation in the beginning, and that feeling of uncomfortableness, because I went to full isolation. The people that love me most and that I loved most passed away. COVID had just happened, right? So I was already isolated from COVID. Then all those people pass away. I was literally by myself. I remember after right before my father died, and when the other three family members died, one right in a row, nobody checked on me for about a year. Like, literally a year. I had nothing, no one, and I was like just drowning in this hoarder house, right? So a lot of that came to the forefront when I came into NA. I was like, "Oh, I like these meetings. I can identify with these people, but I cannot get too close to them, right? Because if I get close to any of these people, I'm just going to get hurt, right? They're either not going to like me, or they're going to go away, or they're going to die, and I don't want any part of that, right?" it was very uncomfortable for me to try to build those relationships. But the first thing that was said in the first meeting I went to was, "You're the most important person here." And I needed that. That was that ego feed I needed after that ego break, right? To say I was wanted or welcome. And that's what drew me in to the program, right? And then from there I started to talk to more people, right? But I still kept my distance. I still didn't really know how to reach out, or if I reached out, that I could trust anyone. And it took time, right? And I was so convinced, because I'm, like I said, I'm almost 40, and I was so convinced at this point that it didn't matter how much time I gave it, right? That it wasn't still going to work, and it I still wouldn't have these things. But I also had never tried to do any of this without my drugs of choice in my system, right? And it is different. I didn't believe it would be different, right? I thought my brain would work just as the same as it did, but it doesn't. It is very different, right? It is very different learning, because one of the suggestions in the recovery that we engage in, right, is learning to sit in that uncomfortableness, right? That's something I was never taught. I didn't even think that was an option. I'm not sure if you knew that, right? But I didn't know that. That was the whole point of using, right? To avoid that uncomfortableness, right? And what it's been teaching my brain, right, is that I can survive that uncomfortableness, because it doesn't feel like that. And for me, it didn't feel like that in the moment. It didn't feel like I could survive that uncomfortableness, because it I felt like it just made me want to die, right? But I'm learning, as uncomfortable as it is, right, that I can reach out. You know, not everybody knows the depths of my trauma, right? I keep that with kind of a more core specialized group, be it my sponsor, which is that chosen person to guide me through the steps, right? With my sponsor and my closer friends, I give them more of the details. But in general, in meetings, right, I just kind of talk about the overall, right? Like, this is what I went through. I like recently, last month, I think it was, or in September, I came into a meeting, I was bawling, right? There was like 2 or 3 days I was just bawling my eyes out. It's the first year that I've dealt with any of those losses clean, right? And my biggest fears happened, right? I was like, what if I can't sleep? What if I can't do anything? And I couldn't. I cried for like 2 days, and all in those moments, right? All I wanted to do was use. I was like, I either need to take my primary DOC so I can go to sleep, or I need to take my secondary one so I can stay up and just, function in this uncomfortableness, right? That's not what happened. I cried, I let it happen. I came to the meetings, I was a hot mess, right? And guess what? I came out the other side of it, right? And so for the first time, my brain was learning, hey, you can survive this. It is gonna be okay, right? And I've never felt like that. I've never felt like it is gonna be okay, right? Have you had any similar experiences in recovery?
Well, uh, I would say that there's been a lot of moments where I struggle inside, my own serenity. And like one of the problems I started recovery with was too much coffee.
Right.
That like I know somebody out there's like, oh boy, look at him, too much coffee. Well,
No,
guess
I feel
what?
you.
It's like when I have 1 cup too many of coffee, I have no chance of peace in that day. Like
Absolutely.
I like not only do I not perceive peace, I don't live in peace. I don't find solutions the same way. And it was something though that took me about 6 or 7 months to fully realize that
Hmm.
I was robbing myself of my own possibility. And that was a really big struggle because the difference between, serene in the steps in the zone, Milan, and not is problem maker versus problem solver. Like one is an
Absolutely.
opportunity to solve problems, and the other state of mind is that everything's a fucking hassle that I'm never going to get past. You know, And
Absolutely.
and one of the things I want to go back to that you were talking about was about the selfishness and self-centeredness. Like they say that we are self-centered in the extreme for like as human beings in our addiction. And this guided meditation that somebody played at this meeting I was at the other week, it talked about how we're like kind of like a body of water. And when there is turbulence in that water,
Mhm.
it does not allow us to see the world clearly because it's like trying to look through, like, so our anger, our
Splashing water.
addiction, our grief, our sadness all make that water wavy so you can't see through it. But what it also does is makes it so that we can't reflect back to the world clearly. So
Hmm.
not only do we not perceive the world clearly, but we don't even know how to react to it clearly because we aren't clear on what we saw. Like
Absolutely.
it's like holding a mirror into turbulent water and then having another mirror, and every time it gets a little bit worse on the clarity.
Hmm.
And so it's almost impossible for us to have even seen what we need to grieve clearly in our addiction because we're filtered at that point. So even if we think we've processed grief, I just don't think that we accurately could have.
Oh, I
Because
agree 100% because
yeah.
it changes our brain chemicals and everything from our natural state, well,
Mm,
from a normal natural state, right, of brain chemicals not
mm.
using, right? So of course it sounds like that. Yeah,
And I
absolutely.
feel like also for myself I was using sadness, anger, and grief as a way to enable more using. Like
I was
so
just
so
thinking
so I
that,
was
yes.
amplifying it. So like it was almost like I didn't want to let go of that because that would
Absolutely.
diminish my reasons to use. And I wanted the big long list of reasons to use.
I went through this. That's what I was just thinking. I remember in the moments, right? Like I would be like, you would use too if you had went through what I went through. Like, how dare you judge me for doing what I do because you have no idea the pain that I'm going through. You would do it too if you went through this. And then, it's funny, I got into recovery, right? And I hear a lot of stories very similar to mine, and they get through it clean,
Yeah.
right? And it's a very eye-opening, and it is very scary like you said, because I wanted that reason to use, right? A part of my brain still holds on to like, it makes me think of the example when I was walking with my son and his cousins one day. I remember thinking this would be so much better if I was high, right? So that diseased thought will still, pop in every once in a while, thinking I would handle this so much better. I would function so much
Mm.
better if I could use right now, right? But I know now, right? In with some sense of clean time, right? That's not the case. That's a lie because it's
Mm.
only gonna, like you said, amplify it and make it worse.
Well, and also we actually have to have a mourning and grief period for our
Ooh.
addictive lives. Like that's
Yes,
gone. That is not in my wheelhouse of options anymore. And so, you know, like quite often what people do is, sorry, I just got to turn one thing on this. Quite often what people do is, they glorify the using days after a while. Like, after
hmm,
after that pain starts to go down, and I saw it even as early as when I was in my treatment center. Like in that
hmm.
first month, I remember people talking shit to each other outside. And I remember the exact day. It was like a couple weeks into the program for me. And I remember thinking, this is wrong. Like this is morally wrong to glorify something that ended in you dying.
Right.
you know
Absolutely.
but I've heard a lot of people say it at different meetings is that like that community, that method of coping with the world is gone. You know, like
Mhm.
our escape system is gone. And now we actually have to face the world as it really is. And that in itself is way harder. It's way more work.
Absolutely.
It's way more work. Like it's so much easier to run away
Mhm.
from life, but it's
Absolutely.
so much less rewarding, you know?
Oh, I agree 100%. Um, and yeah, that just, that oddly enough, that makes me think of something my dad used to say. He used to say I was sticking my head in the sand, right? The pot calling the kettle black, right? But yeah, like that's why I'm really glad, like in our literature, right? It talks about we don't care how much you have, how much you don't have, where you came from, what you did, how you did it, right? All we care about is what your problem is and how you want us to help,
Mm,
right? I love that they keep the focus on that because, ever so often, some people come in and that they're very proud of it, right? Like as much as it hurts them, like you can hear that pain in their voice, you can hear the pain of how much they're struggling, right? But at the same time, they're just so proud, right? Of some of these things they've done, almost like they feel like maybe to be, I think I get the I vibe, right? That they they think to be accepted, right? They had to be the baddest drug dealer on the corner or they don't deserve their seat. But what it says in our literature, right, is that our seat is already paid for in this program, right? That we paid for it with our pain. Right. So that's the beautiful part of it. And I think for a lot of newcomers, that might not be something that they're aware of. It doesn't matter how little or how much you did. If you've hurt, if you have pain because of your addiction or your usage of whatever it may be, you belong here. You're a member as soon as you say you are, right? The
it
beautiful thing.
it was something that I realized inside my recovery was that my superhuman capacity for substances, it was part of how I defined myself. You
Mhm.
know, like I
Absolutely, me too.
I literally was like, just like thought I was such a badass gangster, watching other people, no, and like, boy,
Yep.
yeah, like I could kill myself first. I could kill myself the most. But then it wasn't until I was doing my step work with my second sponsor that it was kind of revealed to me that type of thought is pride. It is pride in the opposite extreme. Like being the worst is also an act of pride, and as much as being the best is. Like it's the same
Absolutely.
thing as somebody who thinks that they're really good looking. And I know I've said it on this podcast before, but I just don't think it can be said enough. It's like to dissect that you can also be prideful on being the worst, because that makes you so special.
Mhm.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
So yeah, for me, like it wasn't being the baddest, right? But it goes right along with what you were saying. For me, it was family tradition, right? I'm just doing what everybody else in my family did. I'm proud of my last name and all the damage and all the dysfunction, right? That I come from, right? Like I'm just holding up the family name, right? But I'm also learning, like you said, it's okay to take pride in being the change, right? Breaking that cycle. And that's something I've thought about for a long time is I want to be that one that breaks the cycle. I want to break the cycle of the trauma and the grief and just dealing with it with all the wrong means, right? I don't want to use drugs or drink to deal with that anymore. I want to be able to, there's a lot of people in the world that go through way worse than anything I could ever imagine, right? There's wars out there, there's all kinds of things going on in the world, and those people are staying clean, right? Or they don't, it doesn't even cross their mind to use, right? So I can be one of those people, right? I can change that for my family, right? Like I can take pride in being the best mom or the best of my last name, right? Like, and that's okay too. And that's a beautiful thing, right?
Well, the purpose of this podcast is to share the freedom rising in our lives.
Absolutely.
And I'm watching it happen to my friends in
Yes.
the community I'm in, and then the other people I'm getting introduced to through this podcast and the meetings I go to, you know, and I think for me, I had an impossible time seeing happiness inside recovery. Like it just like people were happy when they were fucked up. And when they were straight, they were generally burned out and bitchy. And like
Mm-hmm.
myself included, you know, like
Mm-hmm.
there and there wasn't very much straight time to even try to implement happiness, and there was no tools to work on myself enough to bring that joy into my life, which you know the steps themselves. And so um, this is kind of going to lead me into my next question here for you. How can you use the steps to help you process your trauma and grief?
Right. I think the first and the most important thing is talking about it. For me, a long time ago, I heard like in my grief support group, right, that that talking about it multiple times, like in kind of close vicinity, right? That's going to help my brain, right? Because my brain, when I first start telling it, it's going to go immediately into that trauma. So I guess in a way, it's a kind of a desensitization technique, right? I guess would be like the more appropriate term for it. But if I can tell my story enough, right, then I'm not going to have such a rash reaction when I think about it, you know? At least for me, and I've done it and it's worked for me, right? um and then and when I work the steps, right, like to be totally honest, I'm a year in and I've been on step 2 for 8 months, but I needed that because I was a atheist or agnostic, right, at best. The last 15 years that I came from organized religion, went to a spiritual sense in my 20s, right? And then when I lost people and when some bad things happened, right, I was like, if there is a God, he's a sadist. And and now being on step 2 for so long, I've been frustrated with that, right? I'm like, why is this taking so long?" And my sponsor's like, "We move with the time of this spirit or the spirit of time," or I forget how she says it exactly, but she's like, "You're on the step you're supposed to be on." And there's been a reason. So because my first part of step 2 was like, okay, how do I know that there is a higher power, right? And what am I gonna, how do I know what to believe in, right? For me, because I've went through mental health challenges and I can't trust that perception in my brain, or I couldn't trust it, right? I was like, how do I know if I'm talking or if it's my higher power? And then, like 3 or 4 months in, I read in It Works How and Why, right? Like about how that our own brains or the disease will be loud and blatant, and it'll be that impulsive upfront over and over saying or whatever in my mind, right? But if it's the higher power, it's going to be more subtle awareness. I also believe that my higher power walks, talks, and shakes hands. So something I'm questioning, right, I might get the answer through someone, just talking to someone who may not even know anything, right, but that answer that I'm looking for comes through. And then the next part of that step, right, that I've been working on is, trusting it, right? For me, because I went to nursing school, I have a very scientific, like I have to see it to believe it kind of thinking, right? My higher power is unconditional love, right? Because that's something I can understand, right? That's something I have from my child, right? And I've been able to build trust with my higher power because I've seen miracles for me, which are the impossible becoming possible, right? I've seen those biggest things in my legal battles, right? Like I should be in jail for 10 to 15 years, right? I'm not. I'm on a diversion program with a chance to start back my nursing career, right? Like there's just a lot of beautiful things like that that are really, I've been talking about this a lot recently. Before, I came into any program, I didn't believe there was even a light out there, right? After I got out of jail, I still didn't see a light. About that 30-day mark, right? I found my idea of a higher power, right? Then as I am taking 8 months to work on this step 2, and not only did I start to see a light, like, or see that twinkle of a light, right, when I found that higher power, that light is now the sun. right? I can go anywhere now, right? Like that freedom is rising, right? Like it rose out of the light, right? And now I can go anywhere and do anything I want, right? As long as I'm doing it for the doing the next right thing for the next right reason, right? And I just, for it's so crazy to me to look back and I've never seen that light. Even before active addiction, I didn't see that light. And now working these steps with my sponsor in a way and taking that time, right? Take really putting a lot of time, even being frustrated because there's a lot of people that have been in just like 4 months and they're on step 8, right? Like, but really taking the time I need based on what I've went through, based on what I need to do, right? That's what's really opening things up for me. I think it's just such a beautiful journey.
I heard an old timer speak on a speaker tape, and this was a couple months ago. I was driving, and it really struck me as something that I think is really great, and I think you're gonna like it. So he said the one thing he wishes was worded differently in the books was not God of my understanding, but he wished it was God of my experience, because
Right.
because
Yes.
there's a lot of people who stop right there
I was one of those
and
people.
can only focus on trying to understand their higher power, which is probably never ever ever going to happen. Like eventually, you'll just be like, okay, it is what it is. But for him, he's like, if they had just said God in my experience, he's like, I experience it in a
Absolutely.
meeting. I experience
Yes.
it in my life when my life is changing from the program. I'm experiencing it when I have a moment of acceptance or serenity. I'm experiencing it when I do a meditation. And, he said, but so many of us have brains that as soon as we see the word understanding, we're like, oh, I'm failing here because I don't understand.
Right.
Like,
Absolutely. And I
yeah.
would like I said, I was one of those people that you're talking about. Like
Yep.
I didn't think I'd ever work the step. I thought I would just come to meetings. I never thought I'd work
Mm,
the steps or do the sponsor thing, right? Because I was never, the magnetic field around the earth is bigger than I am. How do I pray to it, right? But, as just working the steps with my sponsor, right? I found my way, the way
mm,
that works best for me. And I think that's the best part about this program, right? Is there's no one right way to recover, right? There's a whole world of ways to experience that recover, right? And we're just a couple of examples here being able to share that, right? So that's amazing.
it's one of the things I love about the program is that diversity of experience and getting, constantly reminded of that in shares. Like, I mean,
Mhm.
if we're on an hour meeting and everybody gets 5 minutes, right? You're getting 12 different ways of interpreting
Absolutely.
one thing on that meeting. And my brain thinks like Milan's brain. My brain
Mhm.
interprets like Milan's brain. My brain sees a sentence and it's Milan's brain. And
And now it's open up internationally, right?
that's
Like,
right.
we can meet the Milans in
Mm.
Norway or every other part of the world, right? Like that's now that
That
it's opened up on Zoom, right? It's
that
amazing.
alternative perspective is what, you know, um, is inspiring a lot of the growth. You know,
Absolutely.
and you were saying something about being uncomfortable a little bit earlier, but
Mhm.
uncomfortable is the place where we grow from.
Grow.
Like,
Absolutely.
when I was going through a tough time about a month ago, my sponsor turned and said, I smell growth. I, and I was
Right.
like, fuck, you're right. Like
That's
I didn't want to
absolutely
admit it.
right.
I was halfway into a pity party. You
Right,
know.
right. And I think, sometimes with uncomfortableness, I confuse that with pain, right? Like I confuse being uncomfortable with pain, right? And through the program, I'm learning that it's not, it can kind of feel like pain or it may happen a lot during pain, right? But uncomfortableness doesn't necessarily equal pain, but it does equal growth, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have another question?
Um, Yeah, yeah. Do you feel like at this point in your recovery, have you made it to the end of processing any of those any of the traumatic or negative events in your life? And or have you went through any grief, any situations, right, where you've had to go through the grief process within this program? Have you made it to the other side of that? And how do you feel?
I feel like a new person. I would just like to
Right.
say from that. Okay, so first of all, I really actually had the realization about 3 months ago that the loss of that friend in 2020 was something that I did process this year.
Hmm.
And, I think that I was carrying some guilt at maybe like not being in tune enough with him, not maybe being able to save him from his own addiction or whatever. And, him and I personally were at peace. Like literally, our last phone call was as if we knew we weren't going to see each other again. It was like we both
Right.
confessed this brotherhood love for each other.
Mhm.
We said how much we missed each other and we said we loved each other. And that was our last conversation. And I always have felt like I've had closure with him.
Yeah.
But I felt on a completely unrelated side that maybe I just wasn't listening for some cries of need for help from him. Or, like somehow I let him down. But anyway, it was about 3 months ago, like somewhere between September and October. And I was fully sitting there and I'm like, okay, like I have actually, I have acceptance that he's gone. And, it's not sadness anymore that's sitting there. My love for him still
Mm.
sits there, but it's not sadness. So that was one circumstance for that. And like a lot of childhood stuff I'm not carrying anymore due to my step 4 to step 6. You know, like, man, you are going to get so much serenity, Tess, when you hit those steps.
Right. That's what I was wondering if, you've experienced any serenity from, from some of the
Hmm.
processing, if you, kind of went through the whole thing. Because I know it can take a while, right? Like I'm definitely not through all mine, but I know I'm not even through all mine, and I've already found that pensive cease, that that sense of peace, right? And it's not perfect, it's not constant, right? But it is so much more than what I had in active addiction that it feels constant, right? Like it's very much enough to keep me going and tell me, right, that I'm on the right path, right?
I had a really good surrender, which, to anybody who's new or in the program, the surrender is kind of where you get to stop fighting with those thoughts about your substance and your obsessive thoughts about your addiction and that. And so that's like step 1 to 3, essentially. And,
Mhm.
if you want to learn more about it, give one of us a call and we'll chat about it for a while.
Right.
But that was so profoundly powerful for me that if the program had stopped there, I would have been like, this is fucking amazing. Because at any of the points where I white knuckled it, even my longest one, there was always still that part of me that was cycling on like the, oh boy, there's going to be a weekend eventually, or there's going to be a wedding, or there's going to be something that I'm going to go out, I'm going to use, or I would be cycling on my anger for you because I quit for Tess, I didn't quit for me, like,
Right.
and so I can understand your relief right now because
Hmm.
if the program had stopped there, I still would feel good. But
Right.
I feel like this. I feel like you're looking at an iceberg of recovery right now, and
Absolutely.
you're just seeing this little peak. And meanwhile, this
Hmm.
is how big it is under the water. And,
Right.
and like, here's your 4 to 6, and then here's the rest of your steps. And you're going to be like, I swear I couldn't see the rest of
I
the
look
iceberg.
forward to it.
I
Right?
know.
The biggest experiences of surrender I had, what I have found, right, is that I so at first I'm gonna be all anxious, right? And I say all this stuff just like you went through. Like I think all these things, this is gonna happen, the wedding, this or that, everything's gonna happen, right? But when I surrender it, like I couldn't even dream of the beautiful outcome that comes from when I surrender, right? Like I think it's gonna be all bad. And then I don't even realize like those are the outcome is better than I could have dreamed, right? It's so much higher and it's so much more beautiful and it's so much more open, right, than I could ever imagine. I'm so glad you mentioned that.
Like, and how much time and serenity we waste on trying to rewrite the fucking script 100 times before something happens.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Like I
I agree.
remember when I would have good time, good time, good time. Then I would have to get up sometimes for work. And it would be like I would be supposed to be up by 7, say. Well, from 3:30 to 7, I would literally just cycle on how shitty and how stressed and how shitty and how stressed and
Yes.
how shitty and how stressed and how shitty
Absolutely.
and how stressed. And then when I finally actually have to go out and do one of those things, like, oh, it's not so bad. I'm like,
Wasn't so
what did I
bad.
just waste 4 hours of negative mental cycling for? But, like even substance use and addiction aside, life is like that. Like we waste
Right.
so much of our mental space on shoulda, woulda, and coulda, and boy, I'm gonna. Like, before doing these steps, I was trapped in the past
Yes.
of like of some trauma, some grief, but also some shame and some guilt. And I was like already
Future tripping.
I was already mourning the loss of loved
Yeah.
ones who were sick in order to
Right.
have like a self-induced pity party for years. Like I was
Absolutely.
never ever right here.
In the moment. Yeah.
Yeah. And so they say they speaker I heard, he talks about that you the entire point of this program is about you like getting to the conscious contact with that power, higher power of your understanding, because it's the divergence from that that makes us need this program and go and use and have our addiction. It's like if you're not living by the spiritual principles, right? Then you are probably thinking you're honest, but be acting dishonestly. Probably
Right.
thinking you're compassionate and really being self serving. Probably thinking you're tolerant, but those people really just wronged you. So, this act of intolerance really makes it worthwhile for your perspective. And, bringing those two into harmony is
Mhm.
what can free us from a lot of the past. And,
Absolutely.
and like even for somebody, like where you're not done the steps, it's like if you have that list of spiritual principles and you're checking out if you're really living it, that can be a lot of change right there for your life.
I agree wholeheartedly.
I had a bookmark that they gave out at one of the meetings that they took us to in the treatment center, and it was like 12 spiritual principles. And I loved having that handy all the time because it would just get me to look at it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I got a question for you.
Yes, sir.
How does oh sorry, how has your recovery community helped you with your trauma and grief?
It's given me an outlet to actively process it, right? It gives me a supportive group of people, right, to talk about it with. When I get caught up in that anxiousness, in those intrusive thoughts, in that what if, or I hate myself, right? Any of those kind of negative thoughts, right? I at any time I can get on a meeting and talk about it if I want to, or sometimes what's even better is getting on and hearing other people like going through their trauma, like actively watching them go through this process of trauma and grief, right? Because if it can get me out of my mind, right, that gives me some serenity, right? Um, to be able to help them, right, to come in and listen to someone else processing theirs and be like, oh, hey, I might be able to help them, like I should reach out to them. I know that they might need an ear to listen to right now. I know that they might just want somebody to ask them, are you okay, right? Like, to be able to help someone else during their experiences of trauma and grief, I feel not alone, right? Like I feel like, and it, and I don't go into it thinking, oh, if I go help them, I'm gonna feel better, right? But more often what happens, right, is they need help. And I know that feeling. And I know that when I was feeling like that, this is what I wanted. So let me see if that's what they need. Right. Like it gives me that opportunity to share that trauma and grief. Right. And I believe that pain shared is pain lessened. Right. So it really, it has so many benefits. Um, yeah, it's really it's I feel like I can't find the words for it all, There's so many different outlets it provides. But I think most importantly, I don't isolate now, right? Because of
Mhm.
it. It really between getting all those suggestions constantly, like if you're in pain, talk about it. If you're going through something, talk about it. If I hadn't had that repetition, right? If I hadn't been listening to the suggestions and I just threw it all off, right? I probably wouldn't have done it. But because I've heard that over and over, right? I feel that guilt now, that good kind of guilt saying, you need to talk about it. You don't want to, you need to talk about it. Or, wanting to hide something or, an experience I went through, you should tell people about that, right? You need to tell on the disease, right? I now feel those kind of guilts instead of, oh, oh, I used it, I don't want to tell, right? Like it stops me before I get started now, right? Where I didn't have that before.
Well, they say the opposite of addiction is connection.
Absolutely.
And the surest way to not be thinking about yourself is helping another person. And I've watched you reach out to so many people on the meeting that I know that you're doing service way beyond even what I'm seeing. Like I know an inkling of what you do and I'm already like she's on the right service path. And that's it's a
It doesn't
necessary.
feel like service though, right? It just feels like you're doing for others what you want done for you, right? I don't know if that's how you
Exactly.
feel
But
too, but
well, but that should be your motivation for service
right.
is not like, I'm going to put in my 8 hours of service this week because
Get my
then
gold
then
star.
then God's going to love me. Like,
Right.
I,
Absolutely.
I need 12 hours of service for some sobriety. Here you go. Count 'em, 1, 2, 3. Like,
Yeah, yeah.
but
That's what actually led me out of a certain type of
mm,
organized religion, right? And why I
yeah,
was very hesitant to even try a program of recovery, as we talked about the
yeah.
God and everything before. But yeah, you're exactly right.
I just know that if I'm actively talking to you and listening to what you're saying and trying to have some compassion and some understanding, like an empathy to help your situation, for you to feel heard, then I'm not thinking about me in that moment. Like my
Exactly.
brain just doesn't, they talk about multitasking, but I truly don't believe that you can have two thoughts at the exact same moment. You might have some fleeting secondary thoughts while something's
Hmm.
happening, but I just don't think that you think two things at once. And if you do, I'm going to shoot math questions at you while holding up flashcards,
Right.
and I want you to answer both at the same time. You know,
Right.
prove
Absolutely.
prove me
Yep.
wrong with that, but. Okay, and how does surrender play a part in the acceptance of trauma and grief?
You know, um, so I think the first part for me is accepting, okay, these things have happened. I've done certain things and I've witnessed and I've experienced certain things, right? And they hurt, right? I hurt. Accepting that I feel not just that they happened, right? But that I feel a certain way about them, right? And that um good question. And then the surrender comes in, right? Because what usually happens is if I'm thinking about, okay, they happen and oh, this hurts, this hurts, this hurts, right? Um, I've definitely had those experiences, right, where I've prayed and I'm like, please take this away. And I'm laying there and I'm like, I open my eyes and I'm like, it still hurts. Right? Like it still hurts, right? And then I have to kind of tell myself, right, okay, this is the part where say, okay, I am uncomfortable right now. I'm very uncomfortable with this, right? For the most part, if I can get to that point, a lot of times it's really hard for me to get to that point of saying, okay, I've been praying, I've been doing everything I'm supposed to do, and this is still painful. This is still uncomfortable. If I can get to that point in my brain, a lot of times that's when I feel that surrender, right? That's when like when I have to really acknowledge it, right? And say, okay, this is what happened. This is the result. I've done all the things that have been suggested to me to do, and it still hurts, and I'm okay. It's gonna be okay, right? This is uncomfortable. This hurts. Now, and then I try to physically do something, right? And that helps with that helps with my, at least for me and my surrender, right? Because I get to that point, I admit it, I accept it, and then I'm like, okay, maybe I should take a nap, right? And that's kind of what works for me. I'm sure everybody's got different, some people might take showers, some might meditate, some might go walk, right? Or get on a meeting. For me, I like to take a little nap, right? And I wake up feeling better, right? I try to just give myself that break after I ask for that peace and that surrender, um, and go through that acceptance, right? But it's a very different process. But yeah, what about you?
Well, I would like to say that I do as well like using sleep to turn a page. Like sometimes in my mind, I can't change that page. But almost inevitably closing my eyes, and I'm not a good napper, so it doesn't always happen with napping. Sometimes I have to wait until the night. But even if I sleep 2 hours at night, when I wake up to go pee, it's going to be a different day. And
Yes.
so I agree with that. Things that I use also is exercise,
Hmm.
walking my dogs, enjoying the beautiful nature that I live in, writing songs, as you know, even
YouTube
doing this.
sometimes. I do YouTube
Yeah,
sometimes.
and even doing this podcast, I'm finding, it's amazing how a good conversation about recovery can change my day, or change my understanding even. Like even
Right.
things, every single guest has taught me something inside myself about it. And for me, um, surrender and acceptance are like almost synonymous.
I
You know,
agree.
like
Yeah.
like I don't think you can really turn that wheel over without acceptance of how things are, because otherwise we're still trying. So I feel like maybe I don't know if we really defined surrender in this podcast. And for anybody who's new and just listening, I feel like just to step back a second, but a surrender is kind of the point where you stop trying to control the show. Where, like some people will say, "Oh, I give it over to God's will." Some people say my higher powers will. But truly for me, I'm just happy even saying I living by spiritual principles.
Or I
And
just
those,
don't have power over this anymore.
yeah,
I can't, I
exactly.
have no power over this.
And someone's like, well, how would living those spiritual principles mean that you're not in control? Well, when faced with a decision, am I acting with love? Am I acting with acceptance? Am I acting with tolerance? Am I acting with compassion? Well, if you're choosing those things, which I believe bring us into a state of unity, you know, then the choice is made by the situation.
Like
You know,
going to the store, right? And the cashier is really mean, right? Like, you could be like, how dare you? You're supposed to be nice. This is your job, right? But instead saying, okay, thank you for checking me out. Thank you for your service, and just smiling and moving on, not, reflecting that energy back, right? That's acting in love. I have no power over how that person acts, right?
And
So
that
I
same
just
cashier gives you 20 bucks extra by mistake, you knowing it's going to come out of her wages,
right,
and you're
yes.
pissed off at her. You hand her that 20 back. Why?
Yeah.
Because you're honest.
It's the right
And the
thing.
choice was made by living in those principles. And acceptance is one of those principles. So you may not like how something is in life. And say, example, with trauma and grief, I do not like all the things that happen to me.
Hmm.
And I do not like the fact that that really close friend of mine is gone. But I do accept it. I do accept the fact that he is gone, and I don't need to have sadness accompany my thoughts of him anymore.
And and I think you're also saying, right, like you don't let it because, it hurts that you lost them, right? You don't let that affect either A, the connections you already have with others. It doesn't make you stop or get, distance away from them so you don't feel that pain again, right? Or making connections with new people because you don't want to get hurt again, right?
But I have acceptance for that sadness,
Oh, yeah,
uh, and
absolutely.
and
But you don't
and
let that
that
sadness affect.
loss. But like I'm not going to let it rob my entire future
Right.
of serenity. Like the one thing that I think is like I say a lot of times joy and serenity. And I do not always experience joy in serenity. I
Right.
experience acceptance in serenity, and serenity with joy is just like, whoa, that was like the extra special banana bread that was
Right. The
real
sprinkles.
moist. Like,
The
like
sprinkles on
it's
the
like
top.
when something's really, but if I can just experience like acceptance and serenity, that's enough right now to know that I'm not in the angst that used to occur inside me. And that angst would be anxiety and sadness and anger provoking. Those were all my prelapse things that would take me into relapsing.
Right.
Or, like they
Absolutely.
were my excuses to use. And by doing my step 4 and 5 and 6, I really identified what I was lying to myself about. And those were
Absolutely.
definite things inside that. Do you have another question?
No, you've answered all my questions.
Okay, I got a couple more.
Okay.
If you're still good to go for a few more
Yeah.
minutes.
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Okay, how does your trauma and grief feel different from 1 year ago today to now?
A lot of ways. So I think the first one now, um, probably the biggest one is that I accept them, right? Like I was really living in a state of non-acceptance, right? Like I was angry, I was mad, I hated the world. I felt I felt like personally offended, right? That these people were gone and it was other people's fault that they were gone and I was so mad at those people, right? That took them away from me. And now it's more of like this kind of quiet understanding that it's happened. The other people involved in any of those situations, they may or may not be also experiencing trauma from it. More than likely they are though, right? And I have no power over that, right? I think that's the next thing, right? Is I really understand that the only thing I have control over at this point is how I deal with those losses. As far as some of the trauma, right, some of the abuse and stuff I went to, I understand, like, whereas I knew that it happened and I knew that it was like kind of the root of the problem, right? Well, I've taken that a bit further. Now I know what the problem is. I know what the root of the problem is. How am I gonna help? How am I gonna help use that to help me live through today? how am I gonna make sure that I don't let that affect me today, right? Like um don't want to be mean to someone because I'm in that mindset, right? I don't want to go into work acting like a bitch because I've been thinking about this stuff. It's I'm trying to use it in the solution, right? Rather than in the problem. I'm trying to use it to find that solution of, okay, all this happened. Now, what is everything I've learned from this? How can I make this a better day, or how can I help somebody else? That's usually the bigger point is, I feel like, there's a lot of times people don't have to say anything and I can tell they've been through something similar, right? Or they're in a similar situation even at that given moment. How can I make their day better? How can I use all that pain and do something good with it? Um, and I definitely a year ago, I could give two shits less about how any of that worked, right? It's a whole it's just basically a whole new perspective on all that and utilizing it for something good rather than using it as a reason to use, if that makes sense. What about you?
100%. Well, I think I got into it a little bit on a couple questions ago, but I think I've processed a lot of my grief.
Mhm.
Like on the one that was sitting the heaviest inside my heart. Like I had a lot of family members die inside my addiction that I don't feel pain for.
Yeah.
Like I'm not being rude to any family members out there listening to this. If it was, your mom or your aunt or anybody, it's just that I was numbed. I was numbing
No.
myself
Yeah.
so heavily that I wasn't feeling life, so I wasn't feeling death either. And you know, uh, but my trauma, like from I'm not going to say from 1 year ago today to now. I'm going to go to 14 and a half months, me entering the program, because so much happened in that first 2.5 months for me inside the treatment center and coming out that it would be remiss to start a year ago for me. But since coming into recovery, my processing of trauma that's happened to me puts me back in the driver's seat of my life, in the sense
Yeah.
that I am not poor me, the passenger. I am
Absolutely.
not,
Ah,
I'm not history's whipping post, and I'm not like mama's poor little boy. Like, I'm Milan, and I'm capable of owning who I am as an adult, and I'm not blaming you or anybody else for who I am now. Like for the longest time, I put a lot of blame on other people for my actions and for my emotions, and I'm done with that. Like I'm done with that, and I still catch myself doing it. I'm not saying I'm perfect by any means, but if I look at like the long story of Milan now and was to tell you the tale, it would be so much less blame filled. Aren't
right.
like it would be like so many times, maybe, I failed at my opportunity there to grow and let myself fall into addiction. But that would be the way that I would explain the story, instead of
Mhm.
like I did this because of this. Like nobody, like I know enough now with the tools that I can't lie and say that you made me do anything.
Right.
Like you can always choose to let someone kill you, even if they were pointing a gun at you trying to make you do something. So nobody makes you do anything. And I think that that's the difference, is that I just used trauma as a shield for shitty actions.
Right. And a means of self-pity, right?
Mm,
Because that also
mm.
aided in that excuse to use,
Even
right?
inside, like, even inside the deceitful world of drug sales, well,
Hmm.
I was chintzy because he was chintzy, like, and
Absolutely. An eye
you
for
know
an
like
eye.
yeah, and like so I feel like the program has brought me into like ownership of my life and a reduction in
Mhm.
grief, and really I don't I'm focusing on my recovery, not my addiction and my history, I
Right.
think.
Right. That
So
healing.
now this is my last question. um how do you see Or how, if let's do like a vision right now. How would you envision the upcoming steps helping you cope with your trauma or grief? Maybe if you closed your eyes and pictured how you would like to forecast, the upcoming steps, let us know what your vision of loveliness would be.
Well, for me, I would, to get a little more out of self, right? To take away some of that self-pity I was just talking about. I could only point that out, right? Because if I point it out, I more than likely have it in our and or identify with it, right? Take away some of that entitlement and narcissism, right? Like, not take it away, right? But like deal with some of that to really be able to acknowledge that in myself, because that's what like I feel like I can easily pick out in other people. So that's a sign to me that I can work on that, right? And I think there's a lot of forgiveness that I need to have, both for others but also for myself, right? I think there's a lot of things that I'm really gonna have this self guilt with, right? And I can see that as being one of my um biggest hurdles, right? Alongside that grief, right? Well, and I should say, because it kind of goes together. A lot of that self guilt I have comes as a result of the grief, right? Out of, I wasn't a certain person when that person died. I didn't do the right things when these people died, right? Like, there's a lot of regret I have, and just trying to be able to forgive myself. That's the ideal, right? And then forgive some of the others, maybe that I blame, right, for certain situations. I feel like that would lead to the most the best path of freedom for me, right? How free do I want to be? I want to be free of those things that tie me down. Guilt, regret, and pity, and you know, I don't even know what the word is. Like, and being a know-it-all, right? Like, I think I know it all, right? All the time. I catch that rational side coming out to a defect, right? Just and being able to accept that, right? And know that I'm always kind of doing the next right thing for the next right reason.
Well, I must say I'm very proud of you, and I'm proud to call you my sister, Tess. And it's been an incredible journey. That uh, I've never had a first year in recovery, and we definitely shared a lot of every single
Hmm.
morning together. I'm really
Yeah.
proud and grateful that you were willing to come here on the show. And, to anybody who's new, here's two people who were hot messes. And,
Hmm.
if we can do it, you can do it. If anything, anybody struggling, if you're a friend of mine who's struggling and sees this, call me. I'm happy to help, And
Yeah. Me
okay,
too.
if you've liked what you've seen on this podcast here today, we are trying to help people and as well, help ourselves through this. So please subscribe and share this podcast and like it. Help us get to 100 followers. We're looking for interaction with our audience, so please email recoveryfreedomrising@gmail.com or contact Milan South Okanagan Starcic on Facebook with questions, topic suggestions, or just comments. We would love to hear from you. We're hoping to create slideshows of the Freedom Rising in your lives, so please send any photos of you flourishing in your life as a result of your recovery. Tune in next episode for more recovery fun. Bye bye, everybody. We love you
Bye.
tons.
Thanks, Magic Milan.